Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio's How Stuff Works. Hello and welcome to the podcast for another Casual Friday chat. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
So our first episode this week was about the much adored by me, George Sand.
I adore George Sand also.
It's just so fabulous. I just love the whole idea of her. Yeah, it's interesting. She's one of those ones where because she was so connected to so many other really important people in history, like she's one of those nexus point people. And I even mentioned in the episode that, you know, my time travel dream would be to go back to her house at Nohant when Delacroix was there and hang out. But it is, we talked about it on the show several times, that her life was a very full and rich one. She did not shy away from adventure. She was very much a social butterfly. So, like, it was shockingly difficult to kind of pick through and be like, okay, these are the key things we have to discuss. Mm-hmm. And then figure out, like, what other things you can include that flesh that out without it getting overly complicated. It's tricky.
Yeah.
It's tricky. I always worry particularly about her falling out with Chopin and like how that played out with her daughter Solange. And we didn't get into it much in the episode, but we mentioned that Chopin had come to think of her children as his own in many ways. And I mean, when you consider they were together 9 years and lived as a family, and like during that time, Solange in particular was a little kid. Mm-hmm. Not a little kid, but, you know, a young girl when he met her. And then he was really there for her very formative years and her becoming a young woman and eventually getting married. And so I can understand why he would have felt the closeness with her and the desire to not just cut her out of his life.
Right.
Because of this financial argument that was going on. And then I think about how George Sand felt so completely betrayed by all of that.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating.
Well, and I feel like that's a scenario that has been played out throughout history, including today. Like, I for sure know people who, like, maybe they had been divorced but had a child and had a relationship with someone else afterward that became like a parent for their child. And then when that relationship ended, like what that meant for their relationships with each other and their family unit that had existed. Like,
yeah, it's a complicated thing, right? The mix, the blending and separation of families creates some very, very specifically odd tensions that are different. And because everybody involved has loved one another at some point, presumably if they have reached a point of argument where they feel that they don't want to be around that person anymore, there is so much depth of hurt feeling that, like, I think it's impossible to untangle any logic out of it. Mm-hmm. Like, you can't figure it out. So I think probably there is a tendency on some people's part to sort of vilify George Sand in all of that and be like, what a terrible mother. But clearly she and her daughter had a very volatile relationship anyway. You know, they butted heads now and again, and she probably felt very hurt by the whole thing.
Oh, for sure.
And it's worth remembering that her son-in-law did pull a gun on her. Like, there are factors in there.
There's a lot.
Yeah. And the other thing that we talked about a good bit in the episode, but I just feel bears repeating, is the role of Manceau in George Sand's life. He kind of gets eclipsed by Chopin because he was not famous, but she couldn't have done all that she did in her later years without him.
Yeah.
Like, there's just no way she could have accomplished as much writing and managed her life as well as she did without this person who kind of just silently took care of her and did everything she needed so that she could just pursue her artistic endeavors.
Yeah. One of the things that's interesting to me about that is that in a lot of cases, when there is a male author or musician or artist or whatever who has a wife or a girlfriend or some other woman who is making it possible for him to do that work, a lot of times that just sort of passes without comment.
Yeah.
But, like, not so much the case with George Sand because the gender was different.
Yeah, and it's one of those things I think it's easy for people to forget that in a relationship like that where one person is pursuing creative endeavors or just, leads a very demanding life and the other person is maybe, running house and home. Like that is serious labor to manage all of the day-to-day affairs of a person who is like that. So I hate that it goes unsung for anybody.
Yeah.
It is also unique like you said, in the case of Georgette, because probably at her in the 1800s, there were not a lot of cases like that where
Not as many, no.
where the man would be like, no, I will just take care of you and be your. I don't know that he could be categorized as her muse, but
yeah,
be your support system. I got you.
Yeah, you hear a lot more about like prolific women writers. You hear a lot more about ones who were single for most of their lives. Like that's been a common theme in previous episodes. You don't hear as many historical stories about supportive male partners who made their work possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's very telling that when her son was like, he's got to leave, she's like, all right, I'm going with him. It's interesting to me that was the choice they went with rather than like digging in and fighting over Noel. It was just like, all right, then we'll both leave.
We'll just go. Yeah. Yeah.
George Sand. Who doesn't want to wear frock coats? I just don't even know.
Yeah, it's there was a meme floating around, I think Twitter at some point recently that was like, what is your very specific fiction trope? And mine was like, woman writer who lives in defiance of the norms expected because of her gender. Which has just been like, I've researched several episodes for the show that have been along that theme. But this one was yours.
Yeah, and because she did live so large, she's just a fascinating creature.
Yeah.
I suspect she'd be great fun to hang out with. And I have to admire her hustle. Like the fact that she would be entertaining people, finish a party at like 3 or 4 in the morning and be like, well, I got to go write my 20 pages for the day. What?
Yeah, I can't. As someone who has done National Novel Writing Month, I think 5 times, the idea of maintaining like that level of productivity just forever.
Decades.
Yeah. Not even
decades.
Within my scope of reality.
I get exhausted writing an episode of this show every week. I can't imagine doing 20 pages a day every day. And as a consequence, she in some ways felt like while other people lauded her as being a genius, I mean, Balzac talked about like, she is the best writer living and anybody that doesn't recognize that is an idiot. But she kind of just thought like, I'm just grinding, man. I'm not even, She didn't think she was making art. She just thought she was making commercially accessible content for people because she had to keep supporting all of the people in her life that she was paying for their support. And so she wasn't precious about her writing at all, it seems.
Right.
She was just churning it out. So she didn't think of herself in that way of like, I'm a genius. I'm making this amazing. She's like, I'm just making stuff that I got to sell. I got to make money. She was all hustle.
Yeah. So our other episode this week,
a bit of a gear shift.
A total gear shift from that because it was a 6 Impossible episodes. Folks who really have been listening to the show for a long time and love those had remarked that it had been a while since we had done a 6 Impossible episodes. But our live show in Gettysburg last summer was like 6 Impossible episodes in disguise. It was 100% researched and written in the same way as 6 Impossible episodes are, but I didn't call it that because I didn't think people walking down the street in Gettysburg who saw it on the poster would know what that meant.
Would understand, right.
So I just didn't call it that. The way this one came about, 2 things happened. One is because I cannot add, I had thought that this year was the 50th anniversary of the Greensboro Lunch Counter Sit-ins. It's the 60th. But I had flagged that as an episode, like with it in my calendar in big capital letters, like by February 2020, do this thing. And then I was like, oh, it's actually the 60th. That's still fine that it's the 60th.
Whoops.
But like I had that written, like penciled in for months and months. And we were in Washington, D.C. last year for a show at the National Gallery of Art.
Mhm.
And whenever I'm in Washington, D.C., if I have time, I try to get to a museum, usually one of the Smithsonian museums, because that's usually convenient to where we are, but it depends. This time, I went to the Museum of the American Indian, and one of the things that I saw was a brief thing about the fish-ins. And when I was like, oh, we should totally do an episode about that. And when I got back to my desk, as I was doing my preliminary search on things, I was like, oh, I'm not sure if this will be enough for a whole episode. And Mai was like, oh, what if it were a companion piece to the Greensboro lunch counter thing? And so we could have the Greensboro lunch counter, other sit-in movement episode, and then this 6 Impossible episodes. I very easily found the other 5 things to go in the 6 Impossible episodes. And then when I got into more thorough research about it, I was like, okay, this fish-in movement could have been a whole episode by itself easily. But at that point, I was too far into it to be able to walk it back. Especially the legal angles of all of it. Like, there were so many court cases and so much going on in terms of legal arguments and taking things to court. Like, that could have been an episode on its own. But at the same time, we've got it somewhat covered in the 6 Impossible episodes now.
That particular segment of that episode was delightful to me, only in that the subject matter is difficult because it really always sucks to talk about and to examine the ways that Indigenous peoples have been just treated so poorly. But because it happened in the Pacific Northwest where I lived as a kid, I did not struggle with all of the native names like I would normally.
Right.
Like, I could say Puyallup because I lived there, and Snohomish, very, very natural to me. That part of it was nice.
Yeah. I said this in the episode, but like, I really did I got so angry. And I know there are still people living in the area who feel like there is an unearned level of privilege going on, rather than it being, these are literally fishing rights that were guaranteed by treaty all the way back in the 19th century. Like, I know there are still people who are angry about it, and they may write to us. I don't have a lot. I was so frustrated by so many of the arguments that were made by the sport fishing community during all of that. It made me really, really angry.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have anything else to add about this particular 6 Impossible episodes.
I mean, I will say we have had many, many requests over the years for us to talk about various things related to the AIDS epidemic. And we have both been a little trepidatious about it because we have both lost people.
Uh-huh.
And I remember you had talked about how upsetting this was, and I remember reading through it, and I was like, but I can handle it. I could not handle it.
No, we
had many stops and starts.
We had a lot of stops. I had an acquaintance, and this has been recently, like I had an acquaintance who had survived the height of the 80s, and then in much more recent years, lost his job, lost his insurance, lost access to his HIV medication, and was so ashamed about being HIV positive that he didn't tell anyone. And nobody knew that anything was the matter until he was in the hospital with opportunistic infections. And I'm still so angry that he died, that anytime I try to talk about it, it like just viscerally infuriates me, which makes it really difficult to record even like a 1/6 of an episode on the subject.
Yeah, I mean, I lost a very beloved dance teacher, several friends when I was in college. Having been on like the theater and art scene a lot, there were definitely coming up in the late 80s, and I would get in my car and drive to grown-up places and make grown-up friends. So I kind of had a lot of friends that were just older enough than me that I saw probably more than the average teenager in the late 80s of people who were struggling and dying as a consequence of some of these slowdowns that were being protested in the ACT UP movement and continue to be. And it's one of those things too that like I I'm glad that you specifically called out that this is something that is ongoing and that ACT UP is doing these protests even today to be like, this is not history. There are still people living with AIDS today that need supportive assistance, that need additional education. I mean, we've done so much in the medical community in some ways, but in other ways, there is still this, now there's almost like a weird second wave of stigma of like, I thought we fixed that.
No.
Like among people, particularly that did not grow up in the 80s.
Yeah.
I mean, I do AIDS Walk every single year and have for I don't even know how many years. And it's like there are still people telling their stories about how they, contracted HIV through a variety of ways that they weren't even aware of, were possible at the time, because there is a gap in education in some ways because people think it's a historical event and not an ongoing thing. But also there are still people that are thriving and living with HIV, and but they still need support in some ways. So it is a cause very near and dear to my heart. Consequently, very hard to talk about this ugly part of our history.
Yeah, we stopped more times in that 1/6 of this episode than I think we've had to stop for anything else in recent memory.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's also why when I didn't do the episode in strictly chronological order, because I didn't want that to be the note that we ended on, even though it was really a really important note. I didn't want it to be too early in the episode because I didn't want it to be overshadowed, and I didn't want it to be the last thing that we talked about because I wanted to end on a note that did not feel quite as devastating as that one did.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that's what we had to talk about today. So if you'd like to write to us about this or any other podcast, we're at historypodcast@iheartradio.com. If you have sent us something to the other old email address recently, we probably got that too. We just aren't able to reply to everyone frequently. So that's our email address. We're also all over social media at Missed in History, which is our Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and Instagram. And you can subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, the iHeartRadio app, anywhere else you get podcasts. Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio's How Stuff Works. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.